My name is Thaddeus Blackwood. I was a prison agriculturalist teaching inmates to grow food when the zombie apocalypse erupted. Within 1 week, I watched Portland fall, lost my sister, and fought through hordes of infected using skills I learned behind bars. This is how my seed collection and knowledge of growing in harsh conditions kept me alive when civilization collapsed. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I never thought I'd be making a video like this. My name is Thaddeus Blackwood, but everyone just calls me Thad. Until 3 weeks before everything went to hell, I was the Agricultural Sustainability Coordinator at Stillwater Maximum Security Prison. Fancy title for a guy who taught murderers and armed robbers how to grow tomatoes. I developed this program from scratch, took an acre of useless prison yard and transformed it into a productive farm. Started with just a few raised beds, then expanded to a greenhouse operation that produced enough vegetables to supplement prison meals year-round. The administration loved it because it saved money. I loved it because I could see how it changed the men. There's something about watching a seed you planted push through the soil that gives you perspective. These inmates, some serving life sentences, found purpose in nurturing plants. I watched hardened criminals get excited about germination rates and proper composting methods. We even developed a rainwater collection system that reduced the facility's water consumption by 30%. That all ended 3 weeks before the outbreak. There was a situation in the yard, another inmate group trying to establish dominance. The guards called for immediate lockdown, but I had 6 men in the greenhouse. Standard protocol required me to bring them in immediately, but they were transplanting seedlings that wouldn't survive if abandoned mid-process. I made a judgment call and gave them 15 minutes to finish while I supervised. No incidents, no problems. But administration saw it differently. Security breach, they called it. I was terminated that afternoon. I'd saved most of my paychecks over the years and decided to take some time off before looking for another position. Went to visit my sister Diane in Portland. She's a high school biology teacher, has this nice apartment downtown. I brought my seed collection with me. Force of habit, I guess. Specially selected heirloom varieties I'd been cultivating for years. Different crops that could thrive in challenging conditions. I kept them organized in these little labeled envelopes stored in a waterproof case. Diane teased me about being so protective of them. The night before everything changed, we were having dinner when the news mentioned unusual incidents in rural areas outside Portland. Reports of extremely aggressive behavior in several small communities. A CDC spokesperson suggesting it was a particularly virulent strain of rabies. Diane was concerned. She's always been the worrier between us, but I dismissed it. Living in a prison environment makes you skeptical of sensationalized news. You learn to wait for facts. This will blow over, I told her while washing dishes after dinner. Remember that swine flu panic? Or SARS? Media always needs something to keep people watching. Diane wasn't convinced. This seems different, she said. The school sent out protocols today for possible emergency closure. They've never done that before. I should have listened to her instincts, but instead, I changed the subject. We talked about her students, her dating life, normal things. Then we watched some forgettable movie before heading to bed around 11. I remember thinking about job applications as I fell asleep, wondering if any other correctional facilities would hire someone fired for a security violation. I never imagined that by this time the next night, Portland would be falling apart. That my agricultural knowledge would suddenly become more valuable than money. That the seeds I carried everywhere would represent hope rather than just hobby. The noise that woke me came from the hallway outside Diane's apartment. Shouting, banging, the sound of someone running. It was just after 7 in the morning. Diane was already up, peering through the peephole. "It's Tom from across the hall. she whispered. "He looks sick or something. He's pounding on doors." Tom was her neighbor, a software engineer who'd gone camping for the weekend. I joined Diane at the door just as Tom's shouting became more animalistic than human. Through the peephole, I could see him throwing himself against another neighbor's door, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Blood stained his chin and shirt. "He might need medical help," Diane said, reaching for the doorknob. I caught her wrist. "Wait, something's not right." But I had no idea how not right things were about to become. I convinced Diane to wait while we turned on the local news. The anchors looked tense, reporting multiple violent incidents across the city. Hospitals were filling with bite victims, showing symptoms of extreme aggression. The authorities were advising people to stay indoors until further notice. "This isn't rabies," I said, watching footage of police restraining a thrashing, screaming woman. Her movements reminded me of prison fights I'd witnessed. Uninhibited rage, no concern for self-injury. But there was something else, something worse. A complete absence of human recognition in her eyes. Another loud crash came from the hallway, then screams. Real, terrified screams. "Call 911, I told Diane, moving a heavy bookcase in front of the door. The dispatcher put us on hold. Emergency services were already overwhelmed. We watched through the window as Portland descended into chaos. Traffic jammed the streets below. People ran with bags and children in their arms. A police car sped past, sirens blaring, then abruptly stopped when another vehicle crashed into it. Neither driver emerged. "The grocery store is still open," I said, pointing to the corner market where people were rushing in and out. "I'm going to get supplies before everything's gone." Diane wanted to come with me, but I convinced her to stay put and pack essentials. If things got worse, we might need to leave the city. I grabbed my wallet, keys, and that waterproof case of seeds, still not fully understanding why I felt compelled to take them. The 5-minute walk to the store felt like moving through a collapsing world. A man in a business suit ran past me, blood soaking his sleeve. 2 paramedics struggled with a patient who was strapped to a gurney but fighting with inhuman strength. The grocery store was a battleground of shoving, desperate people. I filled a backpack with non-perishables, water bottles, first aid supplies, and a couple of hunting knives from the sporting goods section. The cashiers had abandoned their posts, so I just walked out with everything. When I returned to Diane's building, the front door was shattered. Blood smeared the lobby walls. I took the stairs 2 at a time, calling Diane's name as I approached her floor. The hallway was eerily quiet, several apartment doors standing open. Tom was nowhere to be seen. The bookcase I'd placed in front of Diane's door was pushed aside. The door itself hung from one hinge. Cold fear gripped me as I stepped inside. "Diane?" I found her in the bathroom, pressing a bloody towel against her forearm. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and focused. "Tom broke through the Hendersons' door," she whispered. "Mrs. Henderson was screaming. I went to help her and he just lunged at me, bit me before I could react." I cleaned and bandaged the wound, trying to keep my hand steady. We both knew what the bite meant. We'd seen enough movies, read enough books, but saying it out loud seemed to make it more real, so we didn't. "You need to leave," Diane said finally. "The radio said the National Guard is setting up evacuation points outside the city. You should go now while you still can." I refused, of course, told her we'd go together when she felt stronger. We both pretended to believe this was possible. Within 2 hours, her fever spiked. Her breathing became labored. I gave her water and Tylenol, knowing it wouldn't help. The city sounds outside grew more chaotic. Car alarms, breaking glass, distant gunshots, and the occasional explosion. The power flickered, then failed completely. As the afternoon light began to fade, Diane grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Her eyes, usually soft brown like mine, had developed a strange yellowish tint. "Promise me you'll go," she said. Each word seemed to require immense effort. "Promise me you'll survive this." I promised, though the thought of leaving her was unbearable. "Take your seeds," she added, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. "This world's going to need them." Those were her last coherent words to me. Within the hour, the fever consumed her consciousness. I handcuffed her to the bathroom pipes using a pair of cuffs she kept from her brief stint as a security guard during college. Left water where she could reach it. Told myself it was just a precaution, that the authorities would find a treatment, that I'd come back for her. Deep down, I knew I was saying goodbye to my only family. I left the apartment as the last daylight disappeared. The streets below had transformed into something from a nightmare. Abandoned cars blocked intersections. Fires burned unchecked in several buildings, and moving through it all were people who weren't people anymore. Hunters seeking prey with terrible single-mindedness. With my backpack of supplies and seed case secured, I began making my way toward the edge of the city, already knowing I had waited too long. I navigated through side streets and alleys, avoiding main roads where possible. The prison had taught me to observe patterns, to anticipate movement, and those skills kept me alive that night. The infected seemed drawn to noise and movement, but they weren't coordinated yet. They still attacked as individuals rather than groups. Military checkpoints had been established at major intersections leading out of downtown, but I could see they were already being overwhelmed. At one barricade, soldiers fired warning shots as a crowd of panicked civilians tried to push through. The gunfire only attracted more infected. I watched in horror as the checkpoint collapsed, soldiers and civilians alike disappearing under a wave of the transformed. That was when I first noticed something crucial about the infected. They didn't fight each other, didn't even acknowledge one another. All their rage was directed at the uninfected. It reminded me of how prison inmates from the same gang would ignore each other during riots, focusing only on rival groups. This wasn't mindless aggression. There was a terrible logic to it. I changed direction, heading toward the industrial district where warehouses and factories might offer better hiding places. The darkness became my ally. Without streetlights, I could move more freely while staying hidden. My years working outdoors had given me night vision most city dwellers lacked. Near the railroad tracks, I encountered a woman hiding beneath an overpass. She was dressed in scrubs, splattered with blood and clutching a medical bag. When she spotted me, she raised a scalpel in trembling hands. "Stay back," she warned. "I will defend myself." I showed her my empty hands. "Not infected. Just trying to get out of the city, same as you." She studied me for a long moment before lowering the scalpel. "I'm Eliza, emergency room nurse at Portland General." "Thaddeus," I replied, "agricultural coordinator from Stillwater Prison." She gave a bitter laugh. "Guess we both know something about containment then." Eliza had been on duty when the first bite victims arrived. The hospital protocols failed almost immediately. Within hours, infected patients were attacking staff and other patients. She'd barely escaped with her medical bag. "The incubation period is decreasing," she explained as we moved cautiously through the rail yard. "First cases took hours to turn. Now it's happening in minutes." The hospital was trying to study it, but everything fell apart too quickly. We made an effective team. Eliza knew medical information about the infection, while I provided practical knowledge about moving undetected. We agreed to travel together, at least until we reached the evacuation point the military had supposedly established at the interstate junction. Dawn was breaking when we reached the highway. What we found destroyed any hope of official rescue. The evacuation point had been abandoned. Military vehicles sat empty, some still idling, Bodies of soldiers and civilians lay scattered across the asphalt, and in the distance we could see military aircraft circling the city center. "They're going to bomb it," I said, recognizing the flight patterns from emergency drills at the prison. "They're giving up on containment." Eliza didn't argue. We took shelter in an abandoned gas station mini-mart just as the first explosions rocked downtown Portland. The ground shook beneath our feet. Black smoke bloomed over the skyline, and the distant sound of structures collapsing echoed across the valley. From our vantage point, we watched the systematic destruction of the city. Precision strikes targeted hospitals, police stations, and government buildings, places where large numbers of infected might be concentrated. Fires spread quickly between strikes, creating a wall of flame that seemed to consume everything. "My sister is in there," I said quietly, watching the inferno spread. Eliza placed her hand on my shoulder. Her fingers were cold, but the gesture provided more comfort than any words could have. When the bombing finally stopped, Portland was unrecognizable. The city I had arrived in just days earlier no longer existed. In its place was a smoking ruin that would become a grave for thousands, including Diane. "We need to move," Eliza said, shouldering her medical bag. "Those fires will drive the infected out into the surrounding areas. They'll be coming this way." She was right. Already we could see figures moving along the highway, silhouetted against the burning city. Their movements were jerky but purposeful, and there were hundreds of them. "The woods," I suggested, pointing to the forested hills that bordered the eastern edge of the city. "Less population density means fewer infected. Plus, I know which plants are safe to eat out there." Eliza nodded, her tired face showing the first hint of hope I'd seen. "You know how to find food, I know how to treat injuries. Maybe we won't die today after all." As we slipped away from the road and into the tree line, I glanced back one last time at the city. The realization hit me then. The world, as we knew it, was over. Whatever came next would be something entirely new, and survival would depend on skills most people had forgotten generations ago. And somehow, my seed collection, the one thing from my old life I'd instinctively brought with me, might prove more valuable than all the money and technology left burning behind us. The forest provided cover but little comfort that first night. We took turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts, though I doubt either of us truly slept. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf jolted us to alertness. The distant glow of burning Portland painted the night sky an ominous orange. When morning came, I assessed our supplies. My backpack contained enough packaged food for maybe 3 days if we rationed carefully. Eliza had bottled water, basic medical supplies, and several prescription medications she'd grabbed during her escape. "We need to be strategic," I said, laying everything out between us. "Food and water are the priorities. Then secure shelter." Eliza nodded, her face drawn with exhaustion. "What about the evacuation? There must be other military checkpoints." I shook my head. If they bombed Portland, it means containment failed. I wouldn't count on official help anymore. Working at Stillwater had taught me to observe patterns, to identify resources others might overlook. As we hiked deeper into the forest, I pointed out edible plants growing alongside the trail. Wild berries were ripening. Certain mushrooms were safe, others deadly. Dandelion greens, bitter but nutritious. Eliza watched intently as I demonstrated which to pick and how to identify them. "In the prison garden, we grew food in the harshest conditions," I explained, digging up some wild onions. "Sandy soil, minimal water, extreme temperatures. You learn to work with what you have, not what you wish you had." We moved steadily eastward, away from the city and major roads. Around midday, we encountered our first rural infected. A solitary figure on a hiking trail, once a jogger based on his clothing. When he spotted us, his reaction was immediate and terrifying. Unlike the somewhat disoriented infected we'd seen in the city, this one moved with alarming speed and purpose. I pushed Eliza behind me and raised the hunting knife I'd taken from the sporting goods section. The infected man charged without hesitation. No self-preservation instinct, no reaction to the weapon. I sidestepped at the last moment, using his momentum against him. He crashed into a tree trunk hard enough to stun him momentarily. I didn't waste the opportunity. The knife plunged into the base of his skull, a technique I'd read about for humane rabbit hunting, now applied to what had once been a human being. He dropped instantly. I wiped the blade clean on his clothing, trying not to look at his face. "You've done that before," Eliza said quietly. "No." I sheathed the knife. "But I've broken up enough of prison fights to understand how to use someone's aggression against them." That night, we found shelter in a hiking cabin. Small, rustic, but with 4 solid walls and a door that could be barricaded. Eliza treated a gash on my arm I hadn't even noticed receiving during the encounter with the infected jogger. Her hands were steady, her movements precise. I wondered how many wounded she'd treated at the hospital before it fell. "The infection is blood-borne," she explained, carefully cleaning the wound. "Transmitted through bites primarily, but potentially any exchange of fluids. The hospital was trying to identify the pathogen when communications broke down." "How fast does it spread?" I asked. "Fast. I watched a colleague turn 30 minutes after being bitten. Later cases were even quicker." She finished bandaging my arm. "But here's the strange part. Some people seemed resistant. A doctor was bitten, but showed no symptoms for hours. We thought he might be immune, but then he turned without warning." Our conversation was interrupted by movement outside. Through the cabin's small window, we saw them. 3 infected moving together in the forest clearing. They weren't wandering aimlessly, but seemed to be searching, scanning the area methodically. When one changed direction, the others followed. "They're coordinating," I whispered, watching their movements with growing concern. "Like they're communicating somehow. Or being controlled by the same impulse," Eliza suggested. We remained absolutely still until they moved on. Their behavior reminded me of something I'd observed in the prison yard, how certain inmate groups would coordinate without obvious signals, operating on some unspoken understanding. It was unsettling to see this behavior in what should have been mindless infected. The following morning, we continued east. Moving with greater caution, we encountered a small stream where we refilled our water bottles. Eliza showed me how to use purification tablets from her medical kit. "These won't last forever," she said, dropping the tablets into our bottles. "We'll need a sustainable purification method eventually." "Charcoal filtration works," I replied. "At the prison, we built water filters using charcoal, sand, and gravel layers. We can replicate that if needed." Our path took us through increasingly rural terrain. Small farms dotted the landscape in the distance, but we avoided them, unsure if they housed survivors or infected. By late afternoon, we reached a paved road with a small gas station convenience store at a rural crossroads. I studied it from the tree line. Might have supplies, but also might have infected. "Or other survivors," Eliza added. "Not everyone we meet will be friendly." She was right to be cautious. As we watched, a group of 4 people emerged from the store. They carried weapons, baseball bats, a crowbar, what looked like a machete. They weren't infected, but the way they scanned the area suggested they weren't looking to make friends either. "We go around," I whispered. "Find another shelter for tonight." Eliza nodded, but as we began to withdraw deeper into the trees, a branch snapped beneath her foot. The sound wasn't loud, but in the eerie quiet of this new world, it carried. The group at the gas station turned toward the noise. We froze, but it was too late. They had spotted our movement. "Hey!" one of them called out. "We see you there. Come out slowly, or we'll assume you're infected." I assessed our options quickly. Running might trigger a chase. Fighting was unwise against superior numbers. So we did what often worked best in prison confrontations. We showed our hands and moved slowly. "We're not infected," I called out, stepping partially from the tree line with empty hands visible. I kept Eliza slightly behind me. "Just passing through." The group approached cautiously, weapons still raised. Their leader, a man with a matted beard and wild eyes, looked us over suspiciously. "What's in the bags?" he demanded. "Food, water, medical supplies," I answered calmly. "We came from Portland." The mention of Portland changed their demeanor immediately. They lowered their weapons slightly, expression shifting from hostility to something closer to fear. "Portland's gone," said the bearded man. "Military bombed it yesterday. Nothing left but fire." "We know," Eliza said quietly. "We saw it happen." The group exchanged glances. Then the leader nodded. "You can come in for water if you need it, but we're not sharing food, and you can't stay." It was a reasonable offer given the circumstances. We followed them to the gas station at a distance. Inside, they had established a makeshift camp. The shelves had been mostly cleared, but they had collected rainwater in buckets. They allowed us to refill our bottles while maintaining a watchful eye. I noticed they had no real organization, no plans beyond surviving another day. In Stillwater, I'd seen how quickly society could form in microcosm, how hierarchies established themselves, how resources became currency, how territories were claimed and defended. This group was still in the chaos stage, not yet thinking beyond immediate needs. As we prepared to leave, I offered a piece of advice. The infected are changing how they hunt. They're coordinating their movements. Watch for patterns. The bearded man scoffed. "They're just rabid animals. Nothing more." I didn't argue. Prison taught me that some lessons people need to learn firsthand. We left quickly, continuing eastward as the day waned. "Those people won't survive long," Eliza observed once we were safely away. "No planning, no cooperation." "They might," I replied. "Desperation is a powerful motivator." We walked for several more hours as the landscape gradually changed. More farmland appeared, open fields interspersed with woodland. As sunset approached, we spotted a property in the distance, a modest farmhouse with adjacent greenhouse and barn. No movement was visible, no vehicles in the driveway, no lights despite the growing darkness. "Could be abandoned," I suggested, "worth checking." We approached with caution, circling the property to observe from all angles before moving closer. The farmhouse windows were intact but dark. The greenhouse glass gleamed in the fading light. A small vegetable garden showed signs of recent tending, but weeds were beginning to encroach. My agricultural instincts stirred at the sight of the greenhouse. Inside would be tools, seeds, growing medium, resources far more valuable than canned goods in the long run. Food could be grown indefinitely with the right setup. This place had potential beyond mere shelter. We checked the barn first, empty except for some farm equipment and hay bales. The greenhouse was next. Inside, I found rows of vegetable plants in various stages of growth. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, all well tended. Irrigation lines ran from rain barrels. It was an elegant, efficient system. "Someone knows what they're doing," I said, examining the soil mixture. "This is professional work." Eliza pointed to a notepad hanging by the door. Last entry was 3 days ago. Temperature and water recordings. Finally, we approached the farmhouse itself. The door was locked, but a window in the back had been left slightly open. I climbed through, then helped Eliza inside. The interior was tidy but showed signs of hasty departure. Unwashed dishes in the sink, a half-empty coffee mug on the table, a jacket thrown over a chair. "Hello," I called out softly. "Anyone here?" No response. We moved carefully through the rooms, finding no one. The house had electricity but no power. Likely solar panels without battery backup. The kitchen had modest food supplies. A rifle cabinet stood empty, suggesting the owners had taken weapons when they left. "We could stay here tonight," Eliza suggested. "Maybe longer if no one returns." I agreed, but something felt wrong. Why abandon such a well-established homestead? The greenhouse alone represented months of work and planning, not something you walk away from unless absolutely necessary. We secured the doors and windows before settling in. After eating a small meal from our supplies, we discussed plans for the following day. The farm had everything needed for sustainable living: water collection, food production, shelter. If truly abandoned, it would be an ideal place to recover and plan next steps. As night fully descended, we heard it. A faint thumping from beneath the floorboards. Eliza and I froze, listening. The sound came again, more deliberate. Not an infected. They wouldn't knock. "There's a cellar," I whispered, spotting a door in the kitchen floor I'd overlooked earlier. "Someone's down there," Eliza agreed. I gripped my hunting knife while Eliza positioned herself near the back door, ready to run if necessary. Slowly, I approached the cellar door and called out, "We know you're down there. We're not infected. We're not here to hurt anyone." The thumping stopped. Then a muffled voice responded, "Prove you're not infected." I recognized the fear in that voice. It belonged to someone who had seen too much already. "I'm a prison agricultural specialist," I answered. "My name is Thaddeus Blackwood. This is Eliza, an ER nurse from Portland General. We're just looking for safe shelter." A long pause followed. Then the voice responded, "I'm coming up. I have a shotgun. Any sudden moves and I'll use it." The cellar door lifted slowly. First, the shotgun barrel appeared, then weathered hands, followed by the face of an elderly man. His eyes were clear, but exhausted, his clothes stained with what looked like dried blood. Behind him, partially hidden, was a young girl no more than 10 years old. "Name's Vernon," the old man said, keeping the shotgun trained on us. "This is my granddaughter Maya." His voice was steady, but I could see he was favoring his right side. "Farm's been in our family 3 generations. "You're injured," Eliza observed, her medical training evident in her quick assessment. Vernon's eyes narrowed. "Not bitten, if that's what you're asking. Took a fall when those things attacked 2 days ago. Ribs are busted, I think." I kept my hands visible, speaking calmly as I would with agitated inmates. "We saw your greenhouse. Impressive setup. You clearly know your agriculture." The mention of his greenhouse softened Vernon's expression slightly. 30 years of organic farming. Maya's been helping me since she could walk. The girl peered around her grandfather, studying us with solemn brown eyes. She clutched a worn teddy bear in one hand and what looked like a seed packet in the other. Eliza took a careful step forward. "I'm a nurse. I can examine your injury if you'll allow it." Vernon hesitated, then lowered the shotgun slightly. "You two got lucky finding this place. We were about to leave it for good when those things came through. Whole pack of them, moving together like wolves. Never seen infected behave like that before." While Eliza convinced Vernon to let her examine his injury, I spoke softly with Maya. The girl was quiet but not shocked into silence. She showed me the seed packet she was holding. Heirloom tomatoes. "Grandpa says we need to save seeds because the stores won't have them anymore," she explained with the straightforward logic of children. Vernon's injury was severe. 3 broken ribs and a deep gash along his side that had been crudely bandaged. Not from a bite, as he'd insisted, but from being thrown against farm equipment during an infected attack. Eliza cleaned and properly dressed the wound, giving him antibiotics from her dwindling supply. "You need rest," she told him firmly. "Moving around will only make this worse." Vernon grudgingly agreed to stay put for the night, allowing us to secure the farmhouse. I implemented some security measures I'd learned at Stillwater, barricading ground floor windows, creating noise traps near entry points, establishing clear escape routes. The farm had good defensive features: elevated position, clear sight lines, multiple outbuildings for fallback positions. Over a meal of canned soup warmed on a camping stove, Vernon explained their situation. They'd been largely self-sufficient on the farm, only learning about the outbreak when their satellite TV picked up emergency broadcasts. They'd planned to shelter in place until Vernon's son and daughter-in-law, Maya's parents, returned from a supply run to the nearest town. That was 4 days ago. "They should have been back same day," Vernon said, pain evident in more than just his physical injury. "Either they're trapped somewhere safe, or they're not coming back at all." Maya had been helping tend the greenhouse while they waited. When the infected attacked, Vernon had barely managed to get Maya into the storm cellar before being injured. "Greenhouse was our insurance policy," Vernon explained. "Food security when everything else fails. That's why preppers always fail. They stock up on bullets and beans but don't think about sustainable food production." I nodded in agreement. At the prison, we called it resilient agriculture, systems that can adapt to changing conditions. As night fell, we established a watch rotation. I took first shift, patrolling the perimeter and checking security measures. The countryside had grown eerily quiet. No distant traffic noise, no planes overhead, none of the background sounds of civilization we take for granted. From the porch, I could see for miles in the moonlight. No lights in any direction. The world had gone dark in more ways than one. I wondered how widespread the infection had become. Had other cities been bombed like Portland? Were there safe zones somewhere? The lack of information was almost as unsettling as the infected themselves. Around midnight I spotted them, moving shadows at the edge of the property. A group of infected, at least a dozen, moving with that disturbing coordination I'd observed before. They weren't approaching the house directly, but seemed to be circling, testing the perimeter. I woke Eliza immediately. "We've got company. Get Vernon and Maya to the cellar." Vernon insisted on staying upstairs with his shotgun, despite his injury. "They attacked from the north last time," he whispered, "broke through the kitchen window. We quickly reinforced that area with furniture. I positioned myself near the front door while Vernon covered the back. Eliza stayed with Maya in the cellar, the trap door left slightly open for quick communication. The infected didn't immediately attack. They continued circling, occasionally stopping as if listening or smelling the air. Their behavior was becoming more sophisticated, more hunter-like. In the moonlight, I could see they were different from the freshly turned infected we'd encountered in Portland. These moved with greater purpose, less frenzied rage and more calculated patience. "They're working together," Vernon observed grimly. "First wave distracts, second wave breaks through. That's how they got me last time." The waiting was excruciating. Minutes stretched into an hour as the infected continued their orbit of the property. Then, without any obvious signal, they charged from multiple directions simultaneously. I braced the door as bodies slammed against it. The windows rattled as infected threw themselves against the glass. Vernon's shotgun boomed from the back of the house. I heard glass breaking, wood splintering. They were getting in. 2 infected burst through a side window I hadn't fully secured. I met the first with my hunting knife, driving it through the eye socket with practiced precision. The second tackled me before I could recover my balance. We crashed into the dining table, sending chairs scattering. Its teeth snapped inches from my face as I held it back with one arm, fumbling for my knife with the other. A shot rang out, and the infected collapsed on top of me. Vernon stood in the doorway, shotgun smoking. Before either of us could speak, more infected poured through the broken window. What followed was brutal, desperate combat. Vernon and I fought back to back, using every weapon and technique at our disposal. I fell into the cold efficiency I'd developed breaking up prison riots. No hesitation, no wasted movement, just the mechanical application of force necessary to neutralize threats. When it finally ended, the farmhouse floor was slick with blood. Vernon had taken a blow to his injured side and was struggling to remain standing. I had cuts and bruises, but nothing serious. Outside, dawn was breaking, revealing the bodies scattered across the yard. "Check on Eliza and Maya," Vernon gasped, leaning heavily on the wall. "Make sure the cellar held." I rushed to the cellar door, relieved to find it intact. Eliza and Maya emerged unharmed, but terrified by the sounds of combat above. While Eliza tended to Vernon, whose condition had deteriorated significantly after the exertion of the fight, I secured the broken windows and doors as best I could with the materials available. Vernon's breathing became increasingly labored throughout the morning. Eliza administered pain medication from her supplies, but her expression told me what she couldn't say aloud in front of Maya. Vernon was dying. The trauma from the initial injury combined with the strain of defending the farmhouse had been too much for his aging body. As Vernon drifted in and out of consciousness, Maya sat beside him holding his hand and occasionally showing him seed packets from the collection they'd been organizing. The sight reminded me painfully of my own seed case, now seemingly more valuable than ever. "Grandpa's been teaching me about succession planting," Maya told me quietly while Vernon slept. "That's when you plant new seeds as soon as you harvest something, so you always have food growing." I nodded, impressed by her knowledge. That's exactly right. It's one of the most important techniques for continuous harvests. While checking the property for any remaining infected, I discovered a battery-powered radio in the barn. It still worked, though most frequencies produced only static. On one channel, however, I picked up a weak transmission, a repeating message about a survivor community established at Clearwater Correctional Facility, approximately 40 miles east of our location. I recognized the name immediately. Clearwater was similar in design to Stillwater, built by the same contractor with nearly identical layouts. If any facility could be effectively secured against infected, it would be a prison. The message included coordinates and stated they had medical facilities, food production, and security. They were accepting survivors who could contribute skills. I brought the radio back to the farmhouse where Vernon had regained consciousness. When I played the message for him, a flicker of hope crossed his face. "Maya needs people," he said weakly. "A community. Not just old Grandpa on a dying farm." "You're not dying," Maya insisted, squeezing his hand. Vernon's eyes met mine over her head. We both knew the truth. Later that afternoon, while Maya was checking on the greenhouse plants, Vernon beckoned me closer. "In the root cellar," he whispered, "behind the potato bins. There's a hidden compartment. Emergency supplies, weapons, ammunition, medicines. Been prepping for years, never thought it would be for this." I nodded, understanding what he was entrusting to me. "Take Maya to that prison place," he continued. "She knows farming better than most adults. She'll be an asset, not a burden. We'll keep her safe," I promised. Vernon nodded. Then his expression grew distant. "My son had the right idea. Wanted me to install solar panels, rainwater collection, the works. I only did half of what he suggested. always thought there was more time. By evening, Vernon's condition had worsened considerably. Eliza had done everything possible with the limited supplies available, but infection had set in. In his more lucid moments, Vernon spoke to Maya about the farm, about her parents, about the seeds they'd collected together. He made her promise to continue their work wherever she ended up. Just after sunset, Vernon called me to his bedside one last time. His voice was barely audible. "Second drawer of my desk. There's a map, local farms, water sources, supply caches, friends who might still be alive. Take it." I squeezed his shoulder gently. "I will. Rest now." Vernon died peacefully in his sleep a few hours later. Maya, exhausted from the ordeal, had finally succumbed to sleep at his side. We decided not to wake her until morning. While Eliza sat with them, I explored the root cellar Vernon had mentioned. The hidden compartment was impressively stocked. Hunting rifles, handguns, ammunition, first aid supplies far more extensive than what we'd been carrying, water purification equipment, and various survival tools. Vernon had indeed been preparing for disaster, though perhaps not one of this magnitude. The map in his desk drawer proved equally valuable. It detailed not only nearby farms and water sources, but also noted which properties had alternative power sources, which had natural springs, which kept livestock. Vernon had created a comprehensive survival guide to the local area. At dawn, we gently woke Maya and told her about her grandfather. She received the news with a stoicism that broke my heart, a child already becoming accustomed to loss in this new world. She insisted on helping bury him in the garden he had tended for decades. After the simple funeral, we gathered in the kitchen to discuss our next steps. The Clearwater broadcast seemed to offer the best hope for long-term survival. The prison would have medical facilities for any future injuries, security measures against infected, and potentially the beginnings of a functioning community. "But what about the farm?" Maya asked, her voice small but determined. "Grandpa wouldn't want to abandon it." I knelt to her level. Sometimes in survival situations, we have to make hard choices. The greenhouse plants will keep growing for a while without us. The rain will water them, and we can take the most important seeds with us. Her eyes lit up at this suggestion. "Like Grandpa's special tomatoes? And the purple carrots?" "Exactly," I confirmed. "We'll create a seed bank to take with us. Your grandfather's legacy." Maya led me to their seed storage. Dozens of carefully labeled envelopes containing varieties I recognized, and many I didn't. Heirloom strains developed for drought resistance, cold tolerance, pest resilience. Combined with my own collection, we now possessed genetic diversity that commercial agriculture had long abandoned. Seeds that could thrive without chemical inputs, that could adapt to changing conditions. As we packed essential supplies for the journey to Clearwater, I tuned the radio again, hoping for updated information. Instead of the automated message, we heard a live voice, someone at Clearwater responding to another survivor group. The transmission was fragmentary, but one phrase came through clearly: infected behavior changing, becoming organized. Prepare accordingly. Eliza and I exchanged concerned glances. We'd witnessed this evolution firsthand, but hearing it confirmed by others made it more real, more threatening. Whatever was driving the infection was adapting, learning. Our window for reaching safety might be closing faster than we realized. We leave at first light tomorrow, I decided, taking only what we can carry efficiently. I looked at my unlikely new family. A nurse with haunted eyes, a child orphaned by apocalypse, and myself, a fired prison gardener somehow becoming responsible for their survival. The journey ahead would test us all. We departed the farm at sunrise, each carrying carefully distributed supplies. I took the heaviest load: weapons, ammunition, and tools. Eliza carried medical supplies and some food. Maya insisted on carrying her own small backpack filled with seed packets carefully wrapped in waterproof material. Before leaving, we secured the farmhouse as best we could. Perhaps someday someone would return here and find the greenhouse still producing. It felt wrong abandoning such a well-established homestead, but Vernon's map indicated the most direct route to Clearwater would take us through areas with minimal population density. Our best chance of avoiding both infected and potentially hostile survivors. The journey began smoothly enough. We maintained a steady pace through farmland and wooded areas, avoiding roads where possible. I taught Maya to identify edible plants along the way, turning our travel into impromptu botany lessons. She absorbed information like a sponge, her natural curiosity providing temporary distraction from our grim circumstances. At Stillwater, I told her as we walked, I had inmates who started out just wanting to reduce their sentences by working in the garden. Within weeks, they were asking for books about soil chemistry and plant genetics. Did they learn to grow purple carrots too? Maya asked, clutching her seed packets protectively. Some became better gardeners than me, I admitted with a smile. One man serving 20 years developed a tomato variety that could thrive in partial shade. Called it Cell Block Red. These stories seemed to comfort her, creating connections between her past life with Vernon and whatever uncertain future awaited us. Eliza, too, listened intently, occasionally asking questions about the prison agricultural program. By midday, we reached a ridge overlooking a small town. Through binoculars salvaged from Vernon's supplies, I could see the community had been hit hard. Abandoned vehicles clogged the main street. Several buildings showed fire damage. Movement in the streets indicated infected presence, though not in overwhelming numbers. We go around, I decided. Too risky to move through. The detour added miles to our journey but kept us safely distant from potential threats. By late afternoon, however, Maya's energy began to fade. She maintained a brave face, but her pace slowed considerably. We should find shelter soon, Eliza suggested, concerned about the child's stamina. I consulted Vernon's map. There's a ranger station marked about 2 miles ahead. Might be defendable for the night. As dusk approached, we located the station, a small wooden structure on stilts, likely used for wildlife observation. Its elevated position provided both visibility and protection. The latter access could be pulled up behind us, keeping ground-level threats at bay. Inside, we found evidence of recent occupation. Food wrappers, a sleeping bag, but whoever had sheltered here was long gone. We established a watch rotation with Maya allowed to sleep through the night while Eliza and I took turns monitoring our surroundings. During my watch, I reflected on how quickly prison skills transferred to apocalypse survival. Constant vigilance, resource management, identifying potential weapons and threats, reading people's intentions, all habits formed during my years at Stillwater now serving vital functions in this new reality. The night passed uneventfully, but dawn brought disturbing signs. From our elevated position, I spotted a massive herd of infected moving through the valley below, hundreds of them moving as a coordinated unit rather than shambling individuals. Their trajectory would cross our planned route to Clearwater. They're migrating, I observed as Eliza joined me at the window, or hunting collectively. Like locusts, she murmured, consuming everything in their path. We waited until the herd passed before descending from our shelter. The detour necessary to avoid their path would add another day to our journey, but safety demanded caution. The additional distance meant conserving supplies more stringently. I showed Maya how to set simple snares for small game, a skill I'd learned from a poacher-turned-prison gardener. Eliza foraged medicinal plants, replenishing some of her dwindling supplies. We moved with increasing efficiency, developing wordless communication systems for warnings and all-clear signals. Late in the afternoon of our second day on the road, disaster struck. While crossing a small stream, Maya slipped on wet rocks and twisted her ankle. The injury wasn't severe, but it significantly reduced our mobility. Eliza wrapped the ankle tightly and fashioned a walking stick, but Maya's pace slowed to a painful crawl. We needed to find secure shelter where she could rest properly. Vernon's map showed a hunting cabin approximately a mile from our position. We reached it as darkness fell, grateful to find it unoccupied and relatively intact. While Eliza elevated and treated Maya's ankle, I secured the perimeter. The cabin had defensible features: solid walls, few windows, a stone fireplace that could provide heat without visible light from outside. We could weather a day here while Maya recovered enough to travel. But as full darkness descended, I heard a sound that froze my blood. Voices. Human voices, approaching through the woods. Not infected, but potentially just as dangerous in this new world where resources meant life and strangers meant risk. "Someone's coming," I whispered, extinguishing our small light. "Multiple people." Eliza quickly gathered Maya into the small loft area of the cabin, while I positioned myself near the door with Vernon's shotgun. Through a crack in the wooden shutters, I counted 5 figures moving through the trees toward the cabin. They carried flashlights and weapons. "I know someone's in there," a male voice called out. "We saw smoke from your chimney earlier. We're not looking for trouble." I remained silent, weighing our options. In the prison, I'd learned that sometimes showing strength prevented violence, while other times it provoked it. Without knowing these people's intentions, any response could escalate the situation. "We've got a perimeter of 15 men surrounding this place," the voice continued, though I'd counted only 5. "Come out peaceful, and we can talk." The claim of additional forces was likely a bluff, but not one I could afford to call with Maya and Eliza's safety at stake. I needed to control the encounter without revealing our vulnerability. "I have a scoped rifle trained on your position," I responded calmly. "State your business, then move on." There was a pause, then, "We're from Riverdale. Looking for supplies, same as everyone. Heard there might be medicine in this cabin." Riverdale, Vernon's map had marked it as a small community about 5 miles west. The name meant nothing to me, but their interest in medicine concerned me. Eliza's supplies were literally life-saving in this world without hospitals. "Cabin's empty of supplies," I lied. "Already cleaned out. Move on, and everyone stays healthy." The standoff continued for several tense minutes before the group retreated into the darkness, their flashlights bobbing away between the trees. But I knew better than to believe they'd given up so easily. The mention of medicine suggested desperation, and desperate people rarely abandon potential resources without confirmation. "They'll be back," I whispered to Eliza once I was certain they were out of earshot. "Probably watching to see if we let our guard down." "Maya can't travel in the dark with that ankle," she responded. "Then we defend until dawn," I said grimly, settling in for a long night. We took turns maintaining watch through the night, using techniques I'd learned monitoring prison yards, changing positions regularly, creating false movement to test if we were being observed, minimizing light and sound. Sure enough, around 3 in the morning, movement near the tree line confirmed my suspicions. They were watching, waiting for an opportunity. By dawn, Maya's ankle had improved enough for limited weight-bearing. We needed to move before our watchers received reinforcements or grew desperate enough to rush the cabin. I formulated a plan based on my knowledge of the surrounding terrain from Vernon's map. "There's a ridgeline half a mile east," I explained quietly. "If we can reach it, we'll have visibility in all directions and multiple escape routes. But we need a diversion to mask our departure." Using materials from the cabin, I constructed a simple timer system that would knock over items and create noise roughly 20 minutes after we left. The distraction might buy us crucial time to put distance between ourselves and our pursuers. We slipped out through a rear window as the morning mist still clung to the forest floor. I carried Maya when her ankle caused her to stumble, while Eliza maintained vigilant watch for both infected and human threats. We reached the ridgeline without incident and took momentary shelter among the rocks to assess our situation. Through binoculars, I observed the men from Riverdale cautiously approaching the cabin after our diversion triggered. Their movements suggested military or law enforcement training, coordinated, disciplined, covering each other's advances. Not typical survivors, but organized and dangerous. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," I said, studying their tactics. "Those aren't desperate civilians." As if confirming my assessment, one man produced a radio and began speaking into it. They were in communication with others, possibly their larger community. The stakes had just risen considerably. We continued moving east toward Clearwater, maintaining coverage and moving as quickly as Maya's injury allowed. By midday, we'd put significant distance between ourselves and the Riverdale group, but I remained concerned about pursuit. They had clearly been searching specifically for medical supplies, which suggested desperation that wouldn't be easily abandoned. Our route took us through increasingly difficult terrain, steep hillsides and dense forest that slowed our progress but provided excellent concealment. I found myself employing tracking techniques I'd learned from a former poacher at Stillwater, carefully disguising our trail and occasionally creating false leads to confuse potential pursuers. "How did you learn all this?" Eliza asked as I showed Maya how to walk on rocks to avoid leaving footprints. "Prison teaches you to be observant," I replied. "I worked with men who had all kinds of backgrounds: hunters, soldiers, survivalists. I listened and learned." By late afternoon, we reached a vantage point that gave us our first distant view of Clearwater Correctional Facility. Even from miles away, the changes were visible. The outer fence perimeter had been reinforced. Makeshift watchtowers stood at corners. Fields once used for recreation now showed orderly rows of plantings. "They've established agriculture already," I noted with professional approval. Our moment of hope was interrupted by movement in the valley below us. A group of at least 12 men was tracking our path, moving with purpose and carrying weapons. The Riverdale group had been reinforced and was gaining ground. "We can't outrun them with Maya's injury," Eliza observed grimly. "Then we talk to them," I decided. "Find out what they really want." We chose our position carefully, a clearing that offered visibility but also proximity to dense forest for retreat if necessary. When the Riverdale group entered the clearing, I stepped forward alone, hands visible but stance firm. "That's far enough," I called out. "You've been tracking us since the cabin. State your business directly this time." Their leader, a hard-faced man with a sheriff's department jacket, assessed me carefully before responding. "We need medical supplies, antibiotics specifically. We have injured people, including children." "Why should we believe you after you surrounded our shelter in the night?" Eliza asked, emerging partially from cover but keeping Maya hidden. "Survival requires caution," the man replied. "Same reason you're keeping your distance now." I studied their group closely, looking for signs of deception. Their clothing was worn but not ragged. Their weapons were maintained. They showed discipline but also fatigue. Most tellingly, none exhibited the 1,000-yard stare of people who had crossed moral lines they couldn't return from. "I'm a nurse," Eliza said finally. "If you have injured people, I can help assess them. But we're taking our supplies to Clearwater. We won't be diverted." The leader's expression changed at the mention of Clearwater. "You're heading to the prison?" "We've heard their broadcasts, but weren't sure it was legitimate." "It is," I confirmed. "They're establishing a sustainable community. Security, agriculture, medical facilities." A ripple of reaction passed through the Riverdale group, hope mingled with skepticism. Their leader conferred briefly with others before turning back to us. "We have a doctor in Riverdale, but no medications. Infection is spreading through our wounded. We were desperate enough to search for supplies, but not desperate enough to take them by force from a child. He gestured toward where Maya remained partially concealed. If Clearwater truly offers what you describe, perhaps we should consider relocating our people there. The negotiation that followed was tense but productive. Eliza agreed to examine their most seriously wounded and provide limited antibiotics if their situation proved as described. In exchange, they would escort us safely to Clearwater, providing protection and additional carrying capacity for our supplies. One condition, I insisted: if Clearwater accepts us, you follow their rules. No separate faction, no power plays. A community survives through cooperation. The sheriff nodded. 4 days ago, we lost 3 people to infected that hunted in coordinated patterns we'd never seen before. Pride is a luxury none of us can afford anymore. As we traveled together toward Riverdale to assess their wounded, I kept alert for any sign of betrayal. But the group's interactions seemed genuine. They shared information about infected behavior patterns they'd observed, confirming the evolution we'd witnessed ourselves. The infected were learning, adapting, becoming more efficient predators. At Riverdale, a small cluster of houses surrounded by a hastily constructed palisade, we found exactly what they'd described. About 40 survivors, including elderly and children, many suffering from injuries sustained during infected attacks. Their doctor, an older woman who had been a general practitioner before the outbreak, was overwhelmed and working without proper supplies. Eliza immediately began triaging patients while I assessed their security and sustainability. Their defenses were reasonably effective against individual infected, but wouldn't withstand a coordinated herd. Their food supplies were dwindling with minimal production capability. Without significant changes, Riverdale wouldn't survive the coming months. The sheriff, whose name was Garrett, recognized their precarious situation. We thought staying mobile was safer than fortifying one location, but these new infected behaviors changed everything. Now we're trapped in a position we can't properly defend or sustain. Clearwater offers both, I confirmed. If they'll accept your group. Maya, who had remained quiet through most of these interactions, suddenly approached Garrett. She held out a seed packet, her precious purple carrots. "These grow fast and don't need much water," she said solemnly. "You could plant them here for the people who stay behind to guard your things." The simple gesture of a child offering hope through seeds visibly affected the hardened survivors. It was the final confirmation I needed that working together offered better chances than remaining separate in this changed world. "We leave for Clearwater at first light," Garrett announced to his people. "Bring only what you can carry and what we need as a community." As night fell, I found myself hoping the broadcast from Clearwater was legitimate, that 40 more lives hadn't just been placed in my hands based on a distant radio transmission and my knowledge of prison architecture. The journey to Clearwater with the Riverdale group was slow but secure. Extra hands meant better watch rotations and more effective defense. We encountered scattered infected but avoided major herds by using scouts and careful route planning. Maya's ankle improved enough for her to walk unassisted, though I often carried her when the terrain grew difficult. As we drew closer to the prison, we began to see evidence of organized operations. Areas had been cleared of infected. Markers placed on trees indicated safe routes. Finally, about 2 miles from the facility itself, we encountered our first Clearwater patrol. 4 people in prison guard uniforms supplemented with makeshift armor, carrying an assortment of weapons. They were understandably suspicious of our large group until I explained my connection to Stillwater and knowledge of prison security systems. The patrol radioed ahead, and we were escorted to a processing area established outside the main walls. What I saw impressed me. Clearwater had transformed its outer perimeter into a multi-layered defense system. The original prison fences had been reinforced with additional barriers. watchtowers were continuously manned. Most significantly, they had cleared the surrounding area and established agricultural plots in the former exercise yards, exactly what I would have recommended. The processing procedure was thorough. Each person was examined for bites or signs of infection. Our weapons were temporarily held. We were interviewed individually about our backgrounds and skills. I explained my role at Stillwater, my agricultural expertise, and our journey from Portland. When I mentioned my seed collection, the interviewer's demeanor changed immediately. "You have viable seeds? Multiple varieties?" I nodded, opening my waterproof case to show the carefully preserved collection. The interviewer called for someone named Director Rhodes. Minutes later, a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair arrived, examined my seeds with knowledgeable hands, and looked at me with newfound respect. "You understand what you're carrying here, don't you? Genetic diversity, future food security. These are priceless." I was reunited with Eliza and Maya in a common area inside the prison's administrative wing. The Riverdale survivors were still being processed, but initial reports suggested they would all be accepted, particularly with their doctor joining the community. Director Rhodes personally gave us a tour of the facility. Clearwater had been in the final stages of a renovation when the outbreak occurred, which meant they had construction materials and tools available. Cell blocks had been converted into living quarters. The industrial kitchen was operational, serving meals prepared from their growing agricultural output. The infirmary had been expanded into a functional hospital, though medications remained scarce. Most impressive was their agricultural operation. The prison's original half-acre garden had been expanded to over 5 acres of intensive production. Greenhouses constructed from prison materials extended the growing season. They had even established a seed-saving program, though their genetic diversity was limited. Until now. "Your collection fills critical gaps," Rhodes explained as we toured the greenhouse. "We've been sending scouts to garden centers and farms looking for exactly these kinds of seeds." As we walked, I noticed several inmates in prison uniforms working alongside civilian survivors. Rhodes explained that when the outbreak hit, the administration had made a controversial decision to offer remaining inmates the choice to join the community as equals rather than abandoning them. Many had chosen to stay and contribute their skills. The world ended. Old sentences became meaningless, she said simply. We needed everyone's talents to survive. I found myself searching faces, wondering if I would recognize anyone from Stillwater who might have been transferred here. In the greenhouse area, I got my answer. Working with seedlings was a man I immediately recognized. Marcus Washington, an inmate I had trained in greenhouse management at Stillwater before his transfer 6 months earlier. When he looked up and saw me, his expression transformed from concentration to disbelief, then genuine joy. "Mr. Blackwood, you made it." The reunion was emotional for both of us. Marcus had taken the agricultural skills I taught him and applied them here, becoming Clearwater's head of seed propagation. He'd survived because of knowledge transferred in a prison greenhouse, a strange but satisfying circle. "Your timing is perfect," Marcus told me after introducing me to his team. "We've just prepared new growing areas, but we're struggling with limited seed stock and expertise. With your collection and knowledge, we can diversify immediately." That night, we were assigned temporary quarters while permanent arrangements were determined. Maya stayed with Eliza, the two having formed a strong bond during our journey. As I settled into the first truly safe space I'd experienced since Portland, I reflected on the improbable journey that had brought me here. 1 month later, the changes were remarkable. The expanded agricultural program I helped establish was flourishing, with multiple growing areas producing food continuously. My seed collection had been carefully propagated, creating backup stocks of each variety. The Riverdale group had integrated well, their skills filling important gaps in the community structure. Eliza now ran a training program for medical assistants, passing on her knowledge to expand their healthcare capacity. Maya had become my unofficial apprentice, absorbing agricultural information with remarkable aptitude and helping teach younger children about growing food. I stood in the main greenhouse watching Maya carefully transplant seedlings with the focused attention only children can bring to important tasks. Her small fingers gently packed soil around delicate stems, her face serious with concentration. "These will be ready to harvest in 45 days, she informed me solemnly. "Then we can save seeds from the strongest plants for next season." I nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of peace despite the fallen world outside our walls. Here, surrounded by growing things, teaching the next generation, I had found purpose again. The skills that had once seemed trivial, teaching convicted felons to grow tomatoes, had become the foundation for rebuilding. The infected continued to evolve outside our walls. Scouts reported increasingly sophisticated behavior, herds moving with apparent purpose, coordinated attacks on smaller settlements, what appeared to be deliberate targeting of agricultural areas. But Clearwater's defenses held, and our community grew stronger with each passing day. We had established communication with other survivor groups and were beginning to create a network of sustainable outposts. My agricultural program became a model shared through this network, with seeds from my original collection now growing in communities across 3 counties. Maya's purple carrots became something of a mascot crop, distinctive, nutritious, and surprisingly hardy. When the first successful harvest came in, the community celebrated with a feast featuring the vibrant vegetables. Maya beamed with pride, finally understanding what her grandfather had tried to teach her about the importance of preserving heritage seeds. I often think about how close we came to losing everything, how a single seed packet might represent a food crop that took thousands of years of human selection to develop, how fragile our existence truly is. And yet, standing in our thriving gardens watching a young girl learn to cultivate life from soil, I also see how resilient humanity can be. The world ended. Civilization collapsed. But in the most unlikely of places, behind the walls of a maximum security prison, we began again, with seeds saved by a fired prison agriculturalist, with medical knowledge carried by an emergency room nurse, with the innocent wisdom of a child who understood that even in apocalypse, we must still plant for tomorrow. This is how we survived the first week. This is how we continue to survive each day since, by growing food where others see only barren ground, by finding hope in tiny seeds, by building community where once there were only captives and guards. The infection took much from us, but it could not take our most essential human quality, our ability to nurture life, even in the midst of death. And as long as we remember that, we have a future worth growing toward.